My former husband had an affair, and I firmly ended the marriage to fight for custody of my son. I relinquished any claim to our assets, leaving the home with nothing. I faced many challenges raising my son on my own until he grew up. I watched him go to college, secure a job, marry, and have children. Just when I thought I could finally enjoy my later years, my son poisoned me. Before I passed, he tearfully blamed me, accusing me of denying him his father's affection and the family wealth that was rightfully his. Upon being reborn in this life, I decided to let him experience his father's love. After divorcing my ex-husband, I chose not to remarry for Julian's sake, wanting to protect him from suffering. Having been out of the workforce for years, I took on all sorts of tough and exhausting jobs to support us both, working as a cleaner, a maternity assistant, and even running a street stall. I was willing to do anything to make ends meet. Although money was tight, we lived a stable life. I earned what I could and guided Julian, helping him grow into a successful adult. Julian didn't disappoint. He got into a prestigious university and secured a good job after graduation. I used half of my savings to buy him a house and help him start his own family. But just as I was ready to enjoy some peace, I fell ill. Though the doctor said my condition wasn't terminal, the treatment was expensive. I was planning to talk it over with Julian, but to my horror, he poisoned my milk. I drank it without suspicion. Soon after, I was gripped by severe stomach pain. Clutching my abdomen, I screamed. Julian, standing nearby, had gone mad. "Mom, don't blame me," he shouted. "You took away my father's love and the Henry family's wealth. Why should I be stuck working a job and struggling with a mortgage? I've had enough of this miserable life. Once you're gone, I can return to the Henry family. Even if you recover, you'll be unable to work. It's better if the money goes to me." Julian's words tore me apart. I couldn't believe my son, for whom I had sacrificed everything, had turned into someone so ungrateful. I gazed upwards, screamed, and then vomited blood before dying in agonizing pain. After my death, Julian returned to the Henry family with his wife and kids. Henry was thrilled to see his son with a family and career. Eager to prove his loyalty, Julian kept flattering him. "Dad, it was Mom who kept me from you. I've always missed you. These past years have been so hard. Mom was strict, and I've never had a good day since I left you. Now that she's gone, no one can come between us. We're finally reunited as father and son." Julian even wiped away tears as he spoke, looking sincere. Henry, seeing how thoughtful his son was, couldn't help but feel proud. He patted Julian's shoulder like a doting father, saying warmly, "It's good to have you back." Floating above, I watched this display of father-son affection, wishing I could tear them both apart. Henry had forced me to divorce him after his affair, and to avoid splitting assets, he blackmailed me by threatening to take Julian. I had no choice but to leave penniless. For over a decade, Henry didn't bother seeing Julian or paying child support. I never imagined Julian would kill me to rejoin the Henry family and bask in their wealth. What a heartless pair, father and son. Fortunately, the heavens intervened, and I was reborn, transported back to the day before I was to divorce Henry. After processing my emotions, I accepted the reality of my rebirth. I looked at the 10-year-old Julian in front of me and asked calmly, "Your father and I are getting divorced. Who do you want to stay with?" At that age, Julian didn't understand what divorce meant. Without thinking, he quickly replied, "Of course, I'll stay with Mom. I love Mom the most." I scoffed inwardly. Did he truly love me? Or was it because he enjoyed the sacrifices I made for him? A cold smile crept across my face. I continued testing him. "But if you stay with me, there won't be a big house, a car, or a nanny. Will you still choose to stay with Mom?" Julian hesitated this time, his expression flickering with doubt. After a pause, he stammered, "Mom, can you and Dad not get divorced?" As expected, Julian was already attached to the Henry family's wealth. Even at a young age, he knew how to chase comfort. In my previous life, I fought tooth and nail for Julian's custody, fearing he would be mistreated if I left him with Henry. But after years of sacrificing for him, all I got in return was betrayal. This time, I would let him make his own choice. Gently, I said, "You're old enough now to decide the life you want. It's up to you who you want to stay with." Julian nodded, lost in thought. To ensure a fair division of assets during the divorce, I went to court with Henry. In my last life, I gave up everything to secure Julian's custody. But now I demanded half of Henry's company shares, all the property we acquired during our marriage, and a portion of our savings. Henry was livid when he heard my demands. "Evelyn, you're dreaming," he sneered. "Yeah, you were the one who cheated," I shot back. "I'm only asking for an equal share of what we built together after marriage." I deserve my portion. Henry dismissed my claim with a cold laugh. You've never worked a day in your life. Everything we have I earned. Why should you get half? I crossed my arms and looked him squarely in the eye. Because of the civil code, Mr. Henry. Surely a savvy businessman like yourself understands the law. Henry's face darkened, but then he smiled smugly. If you fight me for the property, you'll never see Julian again. He knew how much Julian meant to me, how I'd raised him alone since birth, and he used that against me. But this time, I no longer cared about Julian. Do as you please, I replied coldly. Julian belongs with the Henry family. Henry was shocked. He hadn't expected me to abandon the custody battle. Without that leverage, I was composed and sharp. Nevertheless, the divorce proceedings were tough. Henry hired the best divorce lawyer in the city, determined to keep as much wealth as possible. To speed things along, I threw a stack of photographs on the table. Pictures of Henry and his mistress, Vivian, in compromising positions. If you don't finalize this divorce quickly, these photos will be all over the front pages tomorrow. After a long battle, I managed to secure 30% of Henry's fortune. Not as much as I had wanted, but enough. In my settlement, I received enough to start anew. No longer was I the struggling mother who had walked away with nothing in my past life. When the judge asked Julian who he wanted to live with, as expected, he nervously glanced at me and quietly said, I want to live with my father. Even though I had anticipated this, hearing it still caused a deep pain. Julian was old enough to decide whom to stay with after the divorce, and his choice of Henry made it clear he had thought it over carefully. The son I had raised alone was not destined to remain by my side. On the day I left Henry's house, I packed up 3 carloads of my belongings, gathering all the jewelry, clothes, and bags I'd accumulated over the years. In my previous life, out of fear that Henry would fight for Julian, I rushed out without taking anything. This time, however, I made sure to collect everything that belonged to me. Julian stood in the living room watching me, a hint of reluctance in his expression. He grabbed my hand, asking cautiously, Mom, will you visit me in the future? With feigned innocence, I spread my hands and replied, Julian, it's not that I don't want to see you. Your father won't let me. I'm sad too. Julian hung his head in silence, but in my heart, I added, I really don't want to see you either, you ungrateful child. As the car pulled away, I felt an incredible sense of relief. In this life, I was finally rid of these 2 scoundrels. After the divorce, I moved into the spacious apartment I'd won. The neat, clutter-free space gave me a sense of peace, both physically and mentally. After a few days of rest, I pulled out my college degree and graduation certificate. Staring at them, I felt a wave of nostalgia. I had given up my career to be a full-time housewife, dedicating myself to my family and raising Julian. But now that I had no more obligations, it was time for me to return to the workforce and rebuild my career. That night, I contacted my friend Maxwell to organize a reunion with our old college group. They were now all successful professionals in various fields. In my previous life, after leaving the house with nothing but my son, I had avoided asking for help from friends, not wanting to be pitied. But now, I realized the importance of leveraging connections. In this society, personal relationships are often the most practical resource. During the gathering, as we exchanged updates on our lives, several people expressed sympathy when they learned about my divorce. Some even joked that now that I was single and wealthy, I wouldn't have to take care of an old man in the future, suggesting I was fortunate. I smiled, raised my glass, and said, Thank you for not abandoning me, old friends. I also have a favor to ask. Now that I'm re-entering the workforce, if you come across any suitable opportunities, please think of me. Maxwell quickly chimed in. Yes, Evelyn was exceptional back in the day. If you know of any openings, don't hesitate to recommend something for her. Despite their polite laughter, I could tell from their evasive answers that no one was willing to help. After all, with the fierce competition in the job market, who would want to hire someone who had been out of work for so many years? I forced a bitter smile, feeling that the dinner had been a waste of time. As the gathering ended and I was about to leave, I heard a warm voice call out, Evelyn, wait a minute. I turned around to see Daniel, a senior from my college days. What can I do for you, Senior Daniel? I asked, smiling. My law firm is in need of an assistant. If you're interested, you could give it a try, he offered. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly thanked him. Of course, I don't mind. Thank you so much. Daniel was now a partner at one of the top law firms in the city, so arranging for an assistant wasn't a big deal for him. However, the realization that I'd been away from the legal profession for years suddenly filled me with doubt. Could I still do this? Sensing my hesitation, Daniel reassured me, Don't worry, getting back into the workforce will take time, but I know you're capable. Welcome back. After he left, Maxwell teased me. Well, looks like a knight in shining armor came to your rescue. I nudged her playfully, replying, Stop with the nonsense. He's just an old friend from college. The next day, I reported to Daniel's firm. I had graduated from one of the top law schools in the country and had worked as a lawyer before I married Henry. But after our wedding, I believed Henry's promises and chose to stay home, eventually being discarded by him. Thinking back on it now, it was laughable. This time, I was determined to make the most of the opportunity I had been given. Though I had a solid foundation from my previous career, I was still unfamiliar with the current workplace environment and had to relearn everything. Starting from a top student, then becoming a wealthy housewife, and now an assistant, I knew I would have to carve out my path on my own. With Daniel's occasional guidance and my past experience, I quickly adapted to the job. Within just a few months, I was promoted from an assistant to a trainee lawyer. When Daniel reviewed the documents I had prepared, he praised me, saying, I knew I wasn't wrong about you, Evelyn. You're doing a fantastic job. I smiled faintly and replied, Yes, but I divorced too late. If I had done it sooner, maybe I'd be a partner like you by now. Daniel paused for a moment, his tone becoming somber as he said, Perhaps you shouldn't have gotten married at all. I glanced out the window, a wave of bitterness washing over me. Some things people only understand after going through them once, like love, marriage, and family ties. In my last life, I gave everything, only to be poisoned by my own son. Having been reborn, I knew what truly mattered. Not long after our divorce, Henry couldn't wait to marry Vivian. Their wedding was lavish and even made headlines in Haiching. Henry and I met when we were struggling, sharing a single bowl of fried rice. Back then, we didn't have the money for such an extravagant wedding. Now that Henry had become successful, it was clear he wanted to spoil himself. In the corner of the wedding video, I spotted Julian. He was standing by the stage, looking small and hunched. Though he wore a formal suit, he appeared much thinner. Julian had always been a picky eater, and I had been the one to cook for him, figuring out his preferences over time. He was likely struggling with the food made by the housekeeper, which explained his weight loss. But what did that matter to me? This was the life he had chosen, and he'd adapt to the new meals in time. A month later, I received a call from Julian's school. Hello, is this Julian's mother? Yes, what's the matter? I replied. Please come to the school. Julian has fainted, the teacher said. I'm no longer married to Julian's father. Please contact him for anything related to Julian, I responded, trying to keep my distance. We haven't been able to reach him, the teacher said, leaving me no choice but to rush to the school. Julian was lying pale in the infirmary, and after getting the details, I learned he had fainted from low blood sugar. Julian, haven't you been eating properly? I asked. He looked at me, his eyes full of sadness, and said, Mom, the food the housekeeper makes is tasteless. I can't eat it. I want your cooking. Seeing him like that, I felt a flicker of sympathy. After all, I had raised him myself. But then I remembered those cold, cruel eyes when he poisoned me in my past life. I quickly pushed aside any feelings of affection. Julian, just tell the housekeeper what you'd like to eat. Now that your dad and I are separated, I can't cook for you anymore, I said, trying to stay calm. Hasn't your father been taking care of you? I asked. Julian replied softly, Dad and Aunt Vivian are on their honeymoon and haven't come back yet. Can you come home and cook for me? I really want your food. His hopeful eyes looked up at me, but in my heart I scoffed. This kid was clever, pretending to faint to manipulate me into cooking for him while Henry was away. At such a young age, he already knew how to play people for his own benefit. In the past, I would have been heartbroken, but now I saw through his act immediately. The food at home wasn't as bad as he claimed. It was just different from mine. There was no way it had caused him to pass out from hunger. My expression hardened. Julian, I'm busy with work. I really don't have time to cook for you. After all, I'm not a maid, I said coldly. I gave a few instructions to the school doctor and left without looking back. On my way home, I could only blame myself for not realizing sooner how ungrateful Julian was. Since he had chosen to live with Henry, he should no longer expect my motherly care. Time passed quickly, and 2 years later, I had officially gone from being a trainee lawyer to a full-fledged one, handling my own cases. Without the responsibility of a child, I was flourishing at work. I no longer had to worry about Julian's meals, sleep, or health while I focused on my career. I hadn't seen him in a long time. Henry didn't allow me to visit, and honestly, I didn't mind. Maxwell, who worked at Julian's school, told me that Julian was left to fend for himself, and his grades had plummeted. Maxwell had always kept an eye on Julian for me. I had been deeply involved in Julian's upbringing, making sure he excelled. He had been a bright, well-mannered child, winning numerous awards and serving as a role model. But now, without my guidance, no one was paying attention to his well-being or education. Henry was too busy with his business, and Vivian, focused on having another child to secure her place, ignored Julian altogether. As the saying goes, a child without a mother is like a weed. And it was true.
Julian had started picking up bad habits, fighting, smoking, and drinking. Maxwell warned, "If this keeps up, Julian will be ruined. You're his biological mother. You should step in." I casually ran my fingers through my hair, my expression indifferent. Whatever happens to Julian, the Henry family will deal with it. As his biological mother, it's better for me not to get involved. After all, I don't have custody. Every generation has its own fate, I said. Seeing that I had cut ties with the Henry family, Maxwell didn't push the matter further.
Soon, it was Julian's 12th birthday, which is an important milestone in Hai Chang, marking the transition from childhood to adolescence. According to tradition, I had to attend the celebration, even though Henry didn't want me to see Julian. To keep up appearances, he had no choice but to invite me. The event was held at the biggest hotel in Hen, and all the influential figures in the area were present. The upper-class circle in Heqing was small, and I soon spotted several familiar faces, including some partners from my law firm. After exchanging pleasantries, I saw Henry and Julian.
Henry's gaze was different now. Before the divorce, he had always looked down on me for focusing solely on our home and child, thinking I lacked appeal.
But now, seeing how well I had done after leaving him, his expression had changed. "Should I call you Lawyer Evelyn now?" Henry asked playfully. "Whatever you prefer," I replied, nodding slightly and avoiding eye contact, uninterested in engaging with him. I walked past Henry and gently took Julian's hand, giving him the gift I had prepared. "Happy birthday, Julian," I said softly, my tone calm but distant.
Although I had let go of my son, I still had to keep up appearances on the surface. I hadn't seen Julian in 2 years, and now he had grown noticeably taller, almost a full head taller than me. When he saw me, Julian was overjoyed and instinctively moved to give me a hug. I stepped aside to avoid his embrace and patted him on the shoulder.
Julian quickly understood that I wasn't eager for much physical contact with him, and the joy on his face quickly faded. Vivian, who was heavily pregnant, soon approached. "Honey, what are you doing? The baby is kicking, and I'm so tired today," she said, casting a sharp glance at me. Henry's eyes softened into a smile as he saw his beloved wife. "You've worked hard. After this, I'll take you out to buy a bag. When the baby is born, we'll throw a celebration bigger than this one." Vivian rubbed her belly, looking at me with a sense of pride. I knew she was trying to make a point, deliberately flaunting her pregnancy in front of me to show her superiority. She was clearly trying to indicate that her child would receive better treatment than mine in the future. I couldn't help but find it amusing.
Only someone like Vivian would treat Henry, a man of little value, as a prize.
Henry quickly soothed his wife and promised her a gift. Then he assisted Vivian in greeting the guests. As I watched them leave, Julian's expression seemed a bit sorrowful. Although Henry might not have meant anything by his words, Julian clearly felt the sting. Ever since Henry married Vivian, Julian had felt like an afterthought at home. Despite having everything he needed, the fatherly love he yearned for was never given. Henry was either busy with work or spending time with Vivian, leaving no space to care for Julian. Henry had barely been involved in Julian's life as a child, and now, with a new wife, he had even less time for him. This birthday party, though meant to celebrate Julian, seemed more like an opportunity for Henry to network with business partners.
The family seemed outwardly harmonious, but Julian had clearly been pushed aside. Once Vivian's child was born, he would be entirely forgotten by the Henry family.
"Mom, did you miss me these 2 years?" Julian asked hesitantly.
"Of course, Mom missed you," I replied, "but I've been so busy. You see, I'm a lawyer now and have a lot of cases to handle every day." "A lawyer? Can I ask you something?" Julian's eyes sparkled with curiosity. "What question?" I asked. "If Aunt Vivian has a baby, will Dad give all his property to the baby? According to the law, your and Aunt Vivian's baby would have equal inheritance rights. But if your dad makes a will, it depends on his wishes. It's mainly up to your dad," I answered seriously. I knew what Julian was thinking. He feared that the property that was supposed to be his might be taken by Vivian's child. I could tell that he was still the same selfish boy, always concerned about his own interests. Julian had initially chosen Henry because of his family's wealth. So now he couldn't bear the thought of losing what was about to be his. "Mom, will you have another baby?" Julian asked reluctantly. "No, I will only have you as my child," I answered without hesitation. Julian's expression darkened, but he didn't say anything further. A few days after the birthday celebration, news spread that Vivian had suffered a miscarriage.
Julian had acted quickly. He spread cooking oil on the stairs, causing Vivian to slip and suffer severe bleeding. Not only did she lose the baby, but her uterus was also removed. When I heard the news, I couldn't suppress the smile on my face. As expected, Julian had proven to be just as ruthless as I had known him to be. It was a clever move, a deadly one.
I imagine how furious Henry must have been, knowing that the woman he cherished had been harmed by his own son. That must have been quite a blow.
Vivian, devastated, immediately called the police, demanding Julian be arrested. But Julian was still a minor, and he was Henry's only son. So despite Henry's anger, he had to make excuses for him. The story was later spun that Vivian's miscarriage had been an accident caused by the aunt spilling oil.
This incident was swept under the rug. One evening, after working late, I saw Julian looking downhearted at the entrance of the community. I frowned. "What are you doing here so late? Go back to sleep." Julian seemed a bit smug as he looked at me. "Mom, there won't be a little brother to take my property anymore," he said. When I didn't respond, he pleaded, "Mom, can I stay with you? Dad almost beat me to death. With Henry's temper, he won't let me go. He'll punish me for this."
Julian showed me his arm, which was covered with bruises, clearly from Henry's beatings. I pretended to feel sympathy and gently blew on his arm, speaking softly. "Julian, it's not that Mom won't let you stay here, but you know your dad doesn't like me. If he finds out you came here without his permission, he will be even angrier. What if he doesn't want you anymore?" Julian hesitated and then left unsteadily. However, the next day, I received a call from Henry saying that Julian had gone missing and asking if I had seen him. I told him the truth. Henry cursed, then hung up. Julian was later found in an internet cafe playing games with some other youths. Henry dragged him home furious and gave him a thorough beating.
He locked Julian in a room, only allowing him 3 meals a day and forbidding him to leave the room otherwise. Julian, unable to endure the confinement, secretly called me. "Mom, please come and save me. I can't take it anymore," he pleaded. I knew Julian was still a child, and Henry's harsh way of raising him was driving him nearly to madness. I cleared my throat and said, "Julian, listen to your dad. He will forgive you." I have a meeting now, so I have to hang up. Once I ended the call, a smile spread across my face. "Julian, have you had enough of this so-called fatherly love yet?" Vivian recovered and was discharged from the hospital. She had a huge tantrum with Henry, demanding that Julian be sent away if she was to stay in the house. She threatened that she wouldn't remain in the house if Julian was there.
Henry, with no other choice, sent Julian to a boarding school. There, Julian became like a wild animal released into the forest, completely unrestrained. He skipped school, got into fights, and even bullied his classmates. The teachers kept calling Henry, but he ignored it, preferring not to deal with his troublesome son. So he shifted the responsibility onto me.
Though I knew Julian was beyond help, I still had a responsibility as his mother. When I arrived at the school, the teachers scolded me for Julian's actions. Julian's mom, if this continues, will have to ask him to leave school. Parents can't neglect their child's education, especially if they come from a divorced family. Both parents need to be involved. I nodded apologetically. "You're absolutely right. I've divorced his father, and I don't have custody or guardianship, so there's little I can do. But since he's causing trouble at school, you'll need to take him home." Julian hung his head and followed me silently. I asked sternly, "Why did you fight? Why did you bully others?" "They bullied me first. They called me an unwanted child," Julian muttered quietly. I couldn't contain my frustration and retaliated against Julian. He cried, and I reflected on the past. When Julian was with me before, I took care of him with great attention, ensuring he was never harassed at school. This was why he had been able to grow up smoothly and eventually get into college. Without his biological mother's love, Julian now seemed like an orphan. I gently patted his head, saying, "What are you talking about? Don't you have a father? Your father definitely loves you."
Upon hearing this, Julian suddenly became furious, yelling, "He doesn't love me at all. All he does is beat and scold me. He sent me here to suffer." Julian, who had been pampered since childhood, had never experienced hardship, let alone having to manage everything by himself in a boarding school.
"Stop making a scene, Julian," I told him.
"Go home and apologize to your father and Aunt Vivian. You did something wrong, and you should accept the consequences." Julian's sobbing and pleas didn't affect me anymore. After all, he had chosen this path and needed to follow through with it. I shoved him into the car and drove him back to Henry's villa.
When Henry saw Julian, he showed no sign of kindness. Vivian, standing beside him, glared at Julian as though she were ready to consume him. It wasn't hard to guess what Julian would face once he returned home. Back at the law firm, Daniel called me into his office. handing me a stack of papers with a mysterious expression. "This case should interest you," he said. I flipped through the pages and quickly realized it was about Chindu Company, Henry's competitor, suing Henry's company for patent infringement. Daniel smiled. "This is your ex-husband's company."
Now, Chindu is suing Henry's group for infringement, demanding hundreds of millions in damages. If Henry loses, his company might go bankrupt.
I furrowed my brow. "What are the chances of winning this case?" Seeing my uncertainty, Daniel added, "If you're concerned that this case is too difficult, I won't assign it to you. After all, Henry is your ex-husband and your son's custody is still with him." I interrupted, "Boss, this is a large-scale case. I have to take it. Henry deserves to suffer a little."
Daniel smiled. All right, then, it's yours. If you win, you have a strong chance of being promoted to partner this year.
I took the materials back to my desk and started reviewing them carefully.
Henry's company had indeed infringed on Chindu's patent without permission, and the evidence provided by Chindu was extensive. Based on the current situation, Henry was likely to lose. However, business, like a battlefield, meant that determining the outcome of an infringement case was never straightforward.
To secure a promotion, I was determined to take on this case, especially since I already harbored strong animosity toward Henry. After working 3 all-nighters, I managed to organize the case details and figured out my approach. On the day of the trial, I sat at the plaintiff's table, representing Chindu Company. Henry, sitting across from me, had an unreadable expression. He seemed polite, but his demeanor was threatening. "Attorney Evelyn," he began, "this case is not easy. If you lose, it'll be hard for you to recover your reputation in the future. Think carefully." I remained calm and replied, "Thank you for your concern, Henry. But since I've taken on this case, I have a plan." I was determined to win. However, after several court sessions, my arguments and evidence were completely discredited by the judge. In the end, the case was lost due to insufficient evidence of infringement. Upon learning that I was Henry's ex-wife, Chindu Company believed I had intentionally failed to defend well, leading to the loss. They demanded compensation from the firm for the damages, and the situation grew heated in Daniel's office. Daniel spoke coldly. "What's going on here? Did you take Henry's side?" Even though Daniel had been supportive, he began to question my professionalism. I met his gaze and said, "You can doubt my abilities, but not my integrity. There's something strange about this case."
In my previous life, although I had no ties to Henry after our divorce, I had heard about the infringement case between Chindu and Henry's company. Chindu had also lost that case, so when I took it on again, I suspected it was due to an incompetent defense lawyer. The evidence chain was solid, yet the case still ended in defeat.
There had to be something suspicious, especially since Henry, who built his empire from scratch, couldn't have lacked connections. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you can figure out what happened?" I nodded. A week later, the judge involved in the case was exposed, and it was revealed that the infringement case between Chindu and Henry's group, which he had presided over, was to be retried by the higher courts. This time, Chindu won, and Henry was ordered to pay a large sum in damages. When the court session ended, Henry was furious, gritting his teeth and demanding, "How did you know about all this?" I waved my hand dismissively. "I must thank your dear son." Henry slumped in his chair, unable to comprehend how it was his own son who had betrayed him. "Julian? How could it be Julian? I'm his father." I smiled faintly. "Don't forget, I'm his biological mother, too." Julian, who had suffered greatly under Henry and Vivian, had turned to me, expressing a desire to live with me in the future. This ungrateful child was good at assessing situations. He had chosen to live with Henry when he wanted a better life. But when life with Henry wasn't what he expected, he sought refuge with me. Hearing Julian's tears, I felt no sympathy, but I said, "Julian, your custody is with your father. I can't take you in. If you find evidence of your father's wrongdoings, I might be able to apply for custody." Julian, eager for a chance, quickly agreed. Despite his scheming nature, he was still a child who couldn't think ahead and focused only on getting leverage over Henry to change his custody. What I had asked Julian to do was simple: monitor Henry's actions for me. Sure enough, Julian was quite helpful. He took pictures of Henry's private meetings with the judge at home. Henry's act of bribing public officials was proven, and he was also accused of interfering with the judiciary. He was charged and sentenced, and his company was seized. After compensating Chindu, the company declared bankruptcy, and even Henry's personal wealth was confiscated. Julian called me saying, "Mom, I've done everything you asked. Dad's in prison now. Can you come pick me up?" His voice was full of anticipation. "Julian, wait a bit. I'll contact you when I'm free," I replied.
I really didn't have the time to deal with Julian at that moment. since the law firm was hosting a celebration banquet for me after I won the case against Henry. Thanks to the victory, I had successfully become a partner at the firm. Mom, comma. I'll wait for you. Julian eagerly ended the call and waited for me to come pick him up at the villa. However, Julian, who was caught up in the joy of what was to come, didn't notice Vivian standing behind him. Vivian had gotten involved with Henry to secure a wealthy lifestyle, but she never imagined that Julian's actions would cause her to lose her child and be unable to have more children in the future. She had only experienced a few comfortable days, and now Henry, her wealthy companion, had been sent to prison by Julian. All of Vivian's plans over the years had fallen apart. She directed all her anger at Julian when he wasn't around. Vivian raised an axe and struck Julian repeatedly in the chest. Julian didn't have time to resist, collapsing into a pool of blood. By the time I arrived at the scene, Julian was barely clinging to life. He grasped my hand, tears streaming down his face, crying out, "Mom, I was wrong. I was wrong. I shouldn't have hurt you." I stood frozen, realizing that Julian had remembered everything from our previous life. "You remember?" I asked. "Yes, Mom," he said with sorrow. "I was blinded by wealth and fame. I'm sorry for hurting you. You're the only one who truly loved me." Hearing Julian's confession, I felt as still as calm water. The doctor said it wasn't a fatal illness, but it would be expensive to treat. I remained emotionless and spoke softly, just loud enough for Julian to hear. "Julian, the mom who loved you was poisoned to death by you. Have you forgotten?" Upon hearing this, Julian closed his eyes in despair and passed away. Vivian, who had lost her sanity, screamed about getting revenge and was taken into police custody. As I looked at Julian's lifeless body, I stayed silent. Maxwell, thinking I was overwhelmed with grief, tried to comfort me, but I patted her hand, signaling that I was fine. This son, whom I had raised alone, had tragically left me. While I felt sadness, I also felt relief. In the past life, Julian had poisoned his biological mother for wealth and glory, and now, in this life, he traded his biological father for a better life. He was selfish and cold-hearted. He got what he deserved. After Julian's funeral, I took a break from the law firm. Daniel, thinking I had been deeply affected, encouraged me to focus on the positives, telling me life goes on. I smiled and reassured him, "Don't worry, Boss Daniel. I've just become a partner at the firm. I'm not that easily knocked down." Only then did Daniel relax. I boarded a flight south, feeling carefree, finally living the way I had always wanted. I had a loving husband, and everyone around me believed I had a happy marriage. Until one day, a woman rushed up to me and said, "Do you know your husband is reborn? He made you lose your family and everything. Why would you want to make the same mistake again?" Gabriel had fallen in love with me at first sight. Only 2 months after meeting, he pursued me with great determination. Every gesture he made seemed to perfectly match my preferences, always prioritizing me. Naturally, I fell for him. When I got home, Gabriel hugged me as usual. His gentle demeanor was completely different from what the woman had described. "Let's go to Sonia tomorrow on our day off," I suggested. Gabriel paused for a moment, then casually replied, "I'd prefer to stay home with you." I didn't miss the slight shift in his tone. As the woman had said, he hadn't agreed to let me go. "I knew you'd come back to me," the woman said confidently as she drank her coffee. "My name is Ava. I was the third party in your marriage in the past life, but I prefer to call myself his true love." I was puzzled. "Then why do you want to help me?" I asked. She smirked. "Who knows what's wrong with him this life? He made you miserable, but he cried and said he was wrong. He promised to treat you better. Miss Mia, can you accept a marriage built on lies and deception?" She looked at me and said, "Your best option is to get a divorce." Ava's words made me realize how different my past life was from my current one. Gabriel and I had both attended the same university, where he was the president of the student union. He was 2 years older than me and had already made a name for himself. When I went for an interview, he was sitting at the center of the room. He claimed he fell in love with me at first sight and pursued me relentlessly. But in the past life, it had actually been me who fell in love with him and joined the department to start my own pursuit. After meeting Ava, I had a dream. That night, I went back to Gabriel, eager as usual, and asked, "What should I do now?" Instead of offering advice, Gabriel coldly told me, "It's better to improve your skills first." I felt embarrassed and agreed, walking away awkwardly. I woke up from the dream with a strange feeling. Gabriel also woke up and gently patted me, asking, "What's wrong?" The cold version of Gabriel from the dream lingered in my mind. I asked, "Do you find me annoying?" He smiled and hugged me. "Of course not. I can't wait for you to talk more." I didn't respond. My thoughts were a mess, and part of what the woman said seemed true. I still wanted to go to Sonia. Ava said there was an important person there, someone we needed to see. After a long pause, Gabriel finally agreed, squeezing my hand and saying, "Okay." I had another dream that night. It was clear that I was the one chasing after Gabriel, but he was always distant. People laughed at me for trying to win his attention, calling me foolish. Gabriel heard them but never confronted them. At that time, I thought it was okay to be persistent and hoped one day I would succeed. When we arrived in Sonia, Gabriel kept a close watch on me, barely leaving my side. He was so protective that his little finger unconsciously tightened around mine. Unfortunately, he made a small mistake. While he went to get a drink for me, a young man in white approached. As soon as I saw him, I felt a strange sensation in my heart. The young man stared at me, and just then, Gabriel returned with the drink. He rushed over to my side, losing his usual calm demeanor, and his voice turned urgent. "Mia, let's go back." At the same moment, the young man asked, "Miss, may I have your contact information?" Gabriel immediately blocked me and coldly said, "She's my wife." I ignored Gabriel and replied to the young man, "I'm Mia." The man was Ethan. He explained, "When you were pursuing Gabriel unsuccessfully, I confessed to you. You were so heartbroken at the time that you almost agreed to be with me. But men are always fickle. Otherwise, how could he have had an affair with me just a few years after marrying you?" At home, Gabriel was still upset. He questioned why I had given Ethan my name, but he didn't dare to argue and chose not to speak to me. I remembered when I first met Gabriel. He was always anxious, asking me if I loved him. "Would you go back to your old love?" he asked, as though stepping on a cat's tail. Of course not. Who would return to an ex? I didn't know what to think when he said he wouldn't go back to his past. Was he referring to not rekindling his relationship with his ex? Or did he mean he wouldn't come back to me? Gabriel softly whispered in my ear, "Mia, let's have a child." Ava had also mentioned this. "You didn't have children in the 6 years of your marriage with him because Gabriel didn't want to and you were on birth control," she said. It seemed strange. Why had Gabriel never changed his mind in our past life, yet now he wanted a child? "Do you like children?" he asked gently. "I like the ones we'll have together," I replied, smiling as he held my hand, our fingers intertwined. "I can teach him how to draw and raise a mini version of you." I didn't answer him, feeling as if my body was being torn apart. What should I do? Gabriel hasn't done anything wrong in this life, but should I make decisions for myself? In the dream, there was a beautiful scene. Everyone cheering, "Promise him, promise him." Gabriel and Ava stood in the middle of the crowd, appearing like the perfect couple, and no one noticed me, the real wife, in the corner. He looked so happy. I know this is cheating, but I lacked the courage to speak up.
Stolen things should be returned long ago, a cold voice echoed. I stumbled away.
When I returned, Gabriel's face was calm, showing no sign of the happiness he had earlier that afternoon. He was only cold to me. Initially, I thought I should trust my husband, but then, as Ava predicted, I came across some news. Mia's father had found his long-lost daughter. The woman in the picture, smiling beautifully, was Ava, who had visited me several times. "I know you're wondering," she said. "I did steal this position. The real Miss Mia is you. Based on the situation, you should have already recognized your biological parents. The one who actually went to Sonia with you was Ethan, and after you discovered your true identity, Gabriel suddenly agreed to be with you. Everyone is after money, right? So, this time when I went to Sonia, I kept an eye on things secretly."
Sadly, as Ava said, I was indeed Mia's father's daughter. But Gabriel never mentioned it. He even stopped me from going to Sonia, deliberately preventing me from finding my relatives. He wants me to replace you, so he can take the money without hurting your feelings. I asked, "How do I know you're not lying about my husband?" Ava sneered, "I'm helping myself. I still care for Gabriel more than money."
"I want you two to divorce soon." I no longer gave him my whole heart. Gabriel might have sensed something, but he didn't know what was wrong. All he could do was try to be kind to me. When I saw the surprise he had prepared for me, I suddenly felt exhausted. One evening, I told him, "Let's get a divorce." His body stiffened. Once doubt is planted, it begins to grow. I could no longer love him as purely as before. It was better to part on good terms. "Why?" he asked. "Are you hiding something from me?" I calmly replied, and his eyes widened before he laughed. "You know everything." I nodded. "So it's better for us to separate." His gaze became strange, and the emotions in it frightened me. I wanted to leave, but was struck from behind.
The last thing I saw before I lost consciousness was his pitiful look. When I woke up, I was still in the familiar surroundings, but I could feel restraints on my wrists. My heart sank. Gabriel had locked me in bed. The next moment, he opened the door and entered, still acting like the nice guy, as if nothing had happened. Mia, you must be tired.
Come have some porridge, I responded directly. What do you plan to do? Do you realize this is illegal? Gabriel stood up angrily. You and I are legally married. Ethan is the despicable mistress. You want to leave me for him, don't you? He twisted things around. I laughed in anger. Didn't you cheat first? He paused, looking confused, then his face twisted.
You're talking about that woman, aren't you? I said yes. He seemed to find an outlet. So it was her that was overlooked. He laughed and kissed my forehead. Don't worry, no one will bother us soon. Before leaving, he said something that terrified me. I waited anxiously until he returned and quickly asked, What did you do? Gabriel seemed pleased for a moment, climbed onto the bed and hugged me. You care about me.
I didn't want to be the husband of a murderer. I just asked her parents to discipline her properly. He hugged me tightly. You've known for a while that she and I were reborn. Why didn't you say anything earlier? Can I trust you? I closed my eyes. You're also the one who stabbed me in the chest. His face turned grim. Mia, you shouldn't hold this against me for the rest of your life. I remained silent.
How could I fall in love with another woman? I only wanted to punish you a little. He gritted his teeth. Who told you to go after that man when you were already married to me? I held his hand. I wasn't happy in our marriage, was I? You're just scaring yourself. He calmed down. You're always worried about gains and losses, but it doesn't matter. You'll be by my side forever.
I'll show you how much I love you. It would be nice to have a child. Gabriel cut off all my ties with everyone around me. He said we were husband and wife, and no one would suspect what he was doing. I didn't know exactly what he was doing, but I felt forgotten by the world. Under the pressure, I started to feel a little disoriented. Sometimes I thought it wasn't so bad like this. After all, I hadn't been hurt by him in this life.
I should just live happily with him.
One day I heard a voice, Ava's. How did you get in? I asked. Gabriel had locked the door so well. I've always said he has feelings for me. Ava walked around me. You're not going to submit, are you? Men can never change their bad nature. Once they do it, they'll do it again. You must divorce him, Ava whispered fiercely in my ear. At that moment, everything became clear to me.
If I divorced, the ones who would benefit would still be those two scoundrels, especially Ava. She had stolen my identity and gotten the money, and now she wanted to take back her love. What I should do is tame the dogs. After Gabriel came back, I barely spoke to him. I told him I had figured it out and wouldn't think about leaving anymore. Gabriel was overjoyed. He immediately unlocked me and held me in his arms.
But he was still wary of me, not letting me leave. I followed his will. You're going to treat me well this time, right? He nodded eagerly. Okay, you're so popular with girls. I'm not at ease. You should get a vasectomy. As for me, I once fantasized about having a child with him, but he didn't want one. Gabriel hesitated for a moment, but soon agreed. You're not my only choice. I looked into his eyes. Don't do anything to make me unhappy.
As long as you don't leave me, Gabriel rubbed his face against mine, I'll go crazy.
I must leave. I won't let them have their way, and I won't feed myself to the tiger. After I obeyed him for a few days, I finally gained his trust and was allowed to go out for a few days. The first thing I did was find Ethan. He was the only one who could help me. Before I could say anything, Ethan rushed toward me in a panic.
Mia, run. What was going on?
I frowned, recalling Gabriel's insanity. Ethan screamed that it wasn't him who married me, but rather Gabriel. I felt as though a bucket of cold water had been splashed over me. What was happening? Everyone was lying to me. But before he could finish his words, he collapsed. Gabriel's dark face appeared behind him. You had to run out, didn't you? He muttered frantically. I won't let you leave again. True to his word, Gabriel remained unresponsive to my attempts to escape, stubbornly tying me to the bed. Just when I thought I'd be stuck forever, the door suddenly swung open. It was Ava. Without a word, she pulled out an iron bar and shattered the lock. Let's go, she said. I have someone to keep him busy. She led me away, acting as if she was well acquainted with this situation. It's my fault. I didn't expect him to be this crazy. The farther we go, the better, she added. However, we hadn't traveled far before Gabriel blocked our path. No one knew why he had suddenly appeared there, but his face was filled with anger. I should have dealt with you sooner, he growled. I was too soft on you, thinking of our past love. Ava smirked, unfazed. I don't care. Gabriel's eyes locked onto me. I'm your husband.
She's always seen you as a nuisance, and she'll only hurt you.
I took a couple of steps back, unsure whom to trust. It felt like I was trapped in a massive lie. Don't go, Ava pleaded, her face pale. I'm the only one who won't harm you. She looked me straight in the eyes. Because I'm you! At that moment, the Mia family's bodyguards arrived. Despite Gabriel's strength, he couldn't fight off so many of them and was eventually dragged away. I turned to Ava. What do you mean? She explained. Gabriel was reborn into his own body, but I was reborn into the mistress's body. Our marriage had indeed reached an irreparable point. Gabriel remained cold to me after we married, and the thought that he was only with me for the property gnawed at me. Plus, when Ethan invited me to travel, I couldn't shake my depression, so I went with him. A few months later, I learned he was having an affair with Ava. It was deeply painful. She covered her face, saying, Since college, people have told me I can't compare to his first love. Eventually, I discovered that Gabriel had been secretly transferring my father's property. When I confronted him, things got physical, and we ended up on the ground, both realizing we had been reborn. I don't want you to be with him, Ava said, taking my hand.
Even though this is my experience, you are me.
Ava's words seemed absurd, but for the time being, she wouldn't hurt me. Under the protection of the Mia family, I sought out Ethan. What did you mean by what you said last time? I asked. Ethan looked at me with desire. Mia, your husband should have been mine. That madman, Gabriel, he cursed bitterly. He should have been out of the picture back in college. I married you, not him. This didn't match what I knew. I thought we had a loving marriage, but Gabriel, with his dark heart, had seen our happiness and regretted his choices. He even tried to make me cheat, though he quickly added that I had been a loyal wife. When he realized he couldn't seduce me, he somehow got reborn and erased all our memories. I missed you, he said, looking at me with pity. I'm sorry, Mia, he added. But after everything he'd done, I couldn't trust him. This was the third story, the third version. Gabriel had been cruel to me during college, and all these versions didn't explain why he'd become so paranoid. I wandered aimlessly on the street, barely noticing a car speeding toward me. Mia, watch out! Someone shouted, followed by a thud. Blood poured into my eyes. Gabriel, unconscious, was lying there with blood trickling from his mouth.
I wasn't sure if I hated him this much, but I quickly dialed for an ambulance.
Just as I was about to hang up, he reached out a bloody hand to stop me. Are you going to forgive me? He asked. One thing at a time, I replied, but he lowered his head. Then forget it, he whispered. Don't save me if you're just trying to force me. I wanted sincerity. I heard him muttering something under anesthesia during surgery, but I couldn't catch it.
Later, I understood everything when he said, die again, do it again. Suddenly, it all made sense. Gabriel had been reborn more than once. Realizing this made me anxious. He couldn't die. I couldn't accept another life without answers. After he regained consciousness, I sat by his bedside and confronted him. I know everything. What did you learn from your second rebirth? I asked bitterly.
That without me, your life would be more complete? He quickly stood up, ignoring the fallen needle. No, I know that giving you up would make me miserable. I'm sorry, Mia. His apology felt hollow after he'd abandoned me twice. I'm not your experiment. How can something discarded just be taken back? Don't try a third time, I said harshly. It'll only make me hate you more. I decided to divorce him.
I told Ava, and she gave me back my identity, explaining that she had taken my place just to gain power. My obsession with everything had reached its limit, and I promised her I would never forgive Gabriel. Only then did she leave me in peace. The next day, when I opened my eyes, I realized Ava was truly herself. I told her, no need to cheat. I wish you both a long-lasting, happy union. Ava looked horrified.
Mia, why are you still alive? She grabbed my hands in shock. I'm sorry, it seems my survival wasn't what you wanted. Gabriel arrived and immediately recognized Ava as the real her, not me, and his disgust was evident. What are you doing here? He asked. Ava looked as if she might burst into tears. I didn't mean to. Gabriel's expression turned intense. Do you see? You don't have to worry about her ruining our marriage anymore.
I taught her a lesson. I destroyed her career and took away her family. He looked at me, waiting. Are you happy? I shot back, "No, stop blaming others. After all, it takes two to make a mess." I found the couple of the Mia group and embraced them. This feeling, one I hadn't experienced in a long time, made me sad. In the past, I didn't appreciate my parents. Gabriel had stolen my family's property with Ava's help, and they flaunted it as if they had won. The second time, Gabriel had Ava pretend to be me, and I never got to see my parents before I died. Thankfully, everything was back to normal. That night, when I was about to sleep, I noticed movement at the window. Curiously, I peeked outside and was shocked to see Gabriel on the fifth floor. How had he gotten up there? He seemed delirious.
Mia, I never betrayed you. I was just confused about my feelings back then. I was cold to you, but I never hurt you, he sobbed. You thought I was with you for the money, but even without it, I would support you. You killed my parents with your hands, I said without thinking. He shouted even louder, No, it was Ava. She did everything and framed me. I had to leave you, so I did the same to her. He even seemed a bit aggrieved.
Why don't you thank me?
I scoffed. During your second rebirth, you still let her take my place and gave her all the wealth and glory. She had the memories of her rebirth, so why didn't you stop her? Gabriel fell silent for a long time before his face twisted with rage. Of course I didn't want you to have anyone else. I wanted to be the only one you could rely on. I shook my head in disbelief. You still don't know what love is. There's no point in dwelling on this anymore. It's impossible for us to start over. I don't love you. I ordered the bodyguards to throw him out and handed him the divorce papers. Ethan visited, and although I remembered parts of our second life, I refused him. This is better. Now I can stay with my parents and not worry about all those complications.
In the end, Ava took her own life.
I didn't know what had happened to her, but after reflecting on my miserable life in the first version, I couldn't feel sympathy. When signing the divorce agreement, Gabriel looked at me with sincerity, but I signed without hesitation. I had the bodyguards force him to sign, and as he left, he asked, Is it really impossible? You just don't understand that you love me. You should be more tolerant. I've been so good to you.
I shook my head.
The scars will always remain. After that, Gabriel didn't bother me for some time. While I felt relieved, a nagging fear lingered. I had the sense that something wasn't quite right, as if I'd forgotten something important. Live again? Do it again? I realized he was likely to be reborn once more. I immediately ran to his house, and sure enough, the various appliances there made me shudder.
Gabriel returned and warned, Mia, don't even think about committing suicide. I grabbed his neck and shouted, You've already killed me twice. You don't get to do it a third time.